Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
So today's guest is Dr. Bettina Hohnen. Bettina is a clinical psychologist who specialises in working with young people and their families, and it's really good to get the chance to speak with you today, Bettina. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hello, Bettina. Very nice to meet you, and thanks for coming along.
Thanks.
Can you tell us a bit about the work you do to support healthy families?
Yes. So I'm trained as a clinical psychologist. And so we're trained in mental health, and I very quickly specialized in child and family work. I actually also specialized quite early on in working in, it was neurodisability and neurodiversity. It's more called that now at Great Ormond Street Hospital, working with complex children who had, quite complicated developmental needs. And I think the thing when you train as a clinical psychologist, you train in all kinds of different areas. And then I think you have to work out where you want to specialize. Child and family and really neuropsychology was something I was very interested in, like brain and behavior relationships. I actually failed school when I was a kid, came out of school without any A levels at all. So I went back to university late, like in my 20s. And so I think it always really puzzled me about how can that happen to kids, and that you can, really struggle and come out of education feeling like, you don't understand things, thinking you're not very academic or whatever. And then that often isn't the case, and finding the right fit for a child is important. So I think that's my background. Then I'm also very interested in parenting, attachment models of parenting in particular. And I think I've combined those two things now in my work. So I work with parents, often in the context of neurodiversity or some kind of neurodevelopmental difference. So that's kind of my background. And the other thing that I did was wrote a book about the teenage brain, which was I wrote an article about it actually, about education. And we were learning all these incredible things about the teenage brain and how different teenagers are. It's a very particular setting, a very particular time in development. And then a publisher said, do you want to write a book about it? And so that's become an area of expertise of mine as well.
It's really interesting to hear about your experiences of education, actually, Bettina, because I think for any would-be clinical psychologists out there, there's such an emphasis on academic attainment, and people can feel like unless they've always been a straight A student, they're never going to manage to get a place. So really interesting to hear about your journey as being a little different to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think when I did finally come back to education, I had to kind of redo A levels, or I did an access course, and I studied so hard because I so feared failure. But I think then I was just very lucky. I feel very fortunate. I went straight on to do a PhD, and then I thought, no, I really want to work with families. So I ended up doing clinical psychology as well. But I think that's right. I mean, that's one of the big messages I think in life whenever I work with young people, just saying, we have different paths and we can all come off the path at some point, and it's absolutely possible to get back. Yeah.
It's terribly powerful to hear you. Well, you've mentioned the word fail or failure twice already. And I think often children who go through school and leave feeling like a failure carry that with them for much of the rest of their life.
Absolutely. I think and I kind of relate that a bit to what we know about the teenage brain, because one of the things that happens during those teenage years is your identity formation. And you're really establishing who you are, how you're different and similar to other people. And I think those identities can stick. And we know that at the end of this developmental period of brain plasticity, it's quite hard for our brain to change. So we have a stable brain, and it's actually pretty hard to change. And I think identity is one of those things. And I mean, I still struggle with it. I'm heading for 60 very soon, and still can really struggle with feeling like an imposter and thinking, oh gosh, I'm going to get things wrong. Or so I think, in some ways, I think it is quite good for young people to see someone like me who looks like I've got it all sorted out, and to know that there were really many periods in my life when I didn't.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So what kind of situations do you support families with?
So I think at the moment I work a lot in the context of neurodiversity. So parents whose children have had a diagnosis of ADHD or autism in particular. And I think those diagnoses are extremely helpful, but I think they also make parenting a bit more complicated. Sometimes people are diagnosed a bit later. Sometimes we're diagnosing young people in their teenage years, for example. I think there can be a bit of guilt. I can think there can be a bit of confusion for parents. And this idea of how much do I push them and how much do I protect them? Where do I accommodate and where do I expect them to do the things that other children are supposed to do? So that's a lot of what I do in my work now. Sometimes I work with parents whose children are very challenging. Maybe, this idea of failure to launch, a lot of times parents really struggle with holding boundaries with kids. So it can be supporting them in that way, or really just a space to reflect. I think, if you say to me, what's a good parent? I think a good parent is someone who's prepared to reflect on themselves and see what their part is in any difficulties that are going on. So that's the space that I offer parents really to do.
Thank you. What do you mean by failure to launch?
I mean, young people who are at the end of, kind of post 18 or in their 20s, and they're really struggling to develop the skills of independence in life. And they can get very caught in a relationship with a parent where there's this kind of dependency on them, which they resent. And I think the parent wants to help them to kind of launch and be more independent, and the child does, but neither of them know how to do it. And it can be really, really tricky because teenagers want to be independent. They don't want to be told what to do, but some of them don't have the skills and they don't know how to.
Yes, yeah. That's I can feel for that.
Yeah.
I think there's quite a lot of people around like that as well. You can't be helped by the challenges in finding jobs and apprentices and
Absolutely.
activities like that.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a really hard time. I was saying to my colleagues the other night, we were having dinner, and I was saying, gosh, I feel so relieved that I'm at the end of my career, not the beginning. It feels quite daunting, I think, at this particular time. One of the things that I work a lot with parents on, or as a kind of bit of an area of expertise for me, is executive functions. I don't know if listeners have heard of the executive functions. They're this group of skills that help us to regulate our behavior and our emotions, housed in the frontal lobes of the brain. And for some young people, particularly those who are neurodiverse, they can really struggle with the executive function skills. So it's things like being able to plan and organize, but also regulate your emotions, manage your time, those kinds of things. And I think it can be a real sticking point for young people. I think it can really break relationships between parents and kids. Because when a child struggles with an executive function skill, it can seem quite a basic thing. Like, here's a child who can tell you everything that you want, that you want to know about the Second World War, yet they continually forget to hand in their homework, or they don't check their diary to see what they have to do, or they're late for things. And it feels like they're doing it on purpose. And so I work a lot with parents about reframing that as a skill and scaffolding that skill and giving kids the strategies in order to be able to do those things. Because kids don't feel good about themselves when you tell them they're good. Kids feel good about themselves when they do things well. So we have to be supporting them to do things by themselves.
Thank you. What kind of factors influence how we parent? It's quite a big question, isn't it?
Yeah, such an interesting one, though. So a big thing, and one of the things that I really enjoy working with parents on, is thinking about their own experience of being parented. So we all arrive at parenting having had an experience of being parented ourselves, and that was imperfect. Nobody is getting this 100% right. And we learn how to be a parent, often unconsciously, sometimes before we have language, because we learn from a very early stage. Now, children need to be in relationship with their parents. So what children will do is they will make adaptations to their needs, depending on what their parents need. So what happens then is we bring these adaptations into our own parenting, and it can affect how our children grow up. So that's just such a huge influence on how we parent our kids. So just to give you an example, if you grew up in a family where conflict was hard, maybe where you either had a parent who avoided any kind of conflict or became really, really angry when you became angry and shut down your anger. When you have a child, if they show you anger or conflict, then it's going to be very hard for you to manage. Your body might go into this kind of fight or flight. It feels very frightening to you, when actually it's very normal to have conflict, particularly with teenagers. So it's those kind of triggers get in the way of us being able to offer our kids what they need to fully develop psychologically and emotionally. Does that make sense?
Certainly does. But I think you can expand upon it a bit more now, because what I'd like to know from you, and you have touched upon this to some extent already, is why is adolescence such a difficult time for many parents?
So it is it's a very difficult time. And I think it's probably mostly because of the changes that go on. So one of the things we know from this brain science is that around the time of puberty and going through to our mid-20s, the brain is on a very specific stage of development. It's at a very specific stage of development. And teenagers become very focused on certain aspects of the world, and they're driven towards certain experiences. And we used to think that teenagers were difficult and naughty and sulky and they, very problematic. But when you understand what these drives and focuses are, you see that many of the behaviors that we see in the teenage years are actually very adaptive. They're getting the teenager ready for living life as an independent person. But it does mean that their behaviors change, often very suddenly. They turn towards their peers. They're very interested in their peers more than they are in their parents. Teenagers are all about being accepted by peers, finding out who are my tribe, where do I belong. Now, I think that can feel very rejecting for parents. This kid who all they wanted to do was stay home and, cuddle up and watch a film on a Saturday night with their parents. Suddenly they're either in their bedroom or they just want to go to their friend's house. And parents are like, well, what did I do? I love you just as much. So I think it can really feel like a loss. I think that's one huge thing. Teenagers are programmed to have these, what they call, like big adventures. One of the other things of the teenage brain is it really enjoys new things, which is a really good thing because there's so many new things that we have to learn as a teenager. Including our first sexual experience and, going and finding new groups and leaving home without our parents, all of those kind of quite risky things. But that's quite scary for parents. Teenagers are driven for independence and autonomy, as we talked about a bit before. And that means that they suddenly are going to stand up to their parents, maybe for the first time, and say, I don't think I agree with you, actually. I'm seeing things slightly differently. Now, if parents have a problem with conflict, that's going to be really tricky for them. Identity formation is another big thing that's going on, forming your identity. So teenagers are trying on all kinds of different identities. I'm going to be a vegan, or I'm going to try mini skirts. Or I remember when I was a teenager, much to my mum's horror, I lived on the King's Road in Chelsea, and they used to hand out these leaflets for getting a free haircut. I one day I said I'll go and do it. My hair was pretty similar, like brown, at shoulder length. I came out with it shaved at the back and blonde, kind of Mohican at the front. That was a bit of a shock for my mum. But I was trying it out. It doesn't mean it's going to stick, but I think those things can be very frightening for parents. And the other big thing I think is that teenagers have this heightened emotionality. So the teenage brain is set to feel things really intensely, both the good and the bad things. So they can really be very emotional, and parents can really struggle with that as well. Like, what happened to my child? They're so tearful all the time, or they're taking things very personally. So I think there's a lot of things that make it very challenging. I think if we understand those things about the teenage brain, it really helps because we don't see those behaviors. We don't see them as doing something to us. We see them as needing something from us, which I think is a really important shift. I mean, ultimately, being a parent is such an altruistic job, isn't it? We're successful when they leave us, and that leaving us begins during the teenage years.
That's beautifully put, Bettina. But have you ever reflected upon why this particular area of clinical practice is such a passion for you?
What a question. How deep do we go? I mean, I think definitely because of my experience at school. I mean, I had a lot of changes and that went on from school to school and other things that were going on in my childhood. But I think my whole career really has been driven to answer this question about what goes on for children so that they can come out of childhood really feeling like they've failed, feeling like they don't fit, or whatever it is. Mine is one form of it, but many young people have other forms of it. So I think it's maybe a lot of us, don't we? We go into professions where we're trying to answer questions about ourselves ultimately. But I think the teenage brain was also a bit of that. I was not very good at focusing on my studies. I was very good at focusing on my friends. I remember lots of risky behaviors going on. But yeah, I think it's quite personal.
Thank you.
So Bettina, you've already, I suppose, kind of hinted at it, but why do parents find it so hard to talk to their teenagers?
Well, teens don't always make it easy. I think they can shut them down, they can shut them out, they can go back to their, go into their bedroom, turn towards their friends. And I think this brings up some of this. Actually, there's something called Circle of Security. I don't know if you heard. It's a really great parenting course. And they have this concept in Circle of Security called shark music. And it is this idea that when your child does something that feels dangerous to you, you have this sharp music in your head, that kind of thing. And I think a lot of parents, their sharp music will be triggered by some of these things that we talked about, our distancing, some of the identity things, our children showing big emotions. So when a child becomes a teenager, I think it requires different skills of us. Because of these changes in their brain development, there are certain things they need from us that are probably different to what they needed when we were younger. And one of the things that I think parents get wrong inadvertently is that they want to fix things, they want to make things better, and they're not very good at listening. And actually, what teenagers often want more than anything in the world is just a listening ear. And parents will come, a child comes home and says, oh, my friend has left me out, or something terrible has happened. And because the parent loves them so much, it comes from a very good place. They jump in and they say, well, have you tried this? And did you do that? And actually, that will shut teenagers down. They don't want to hear that. So, and I think it only actually takes one or two experiences of that for teenagers to say, I'm not going to take this to my mum anymore. So I think at the beginning of the teenage years, when these big emotions show up, there might be one or two experiences where a parent gets that wrong and a child says, okay, I'm not going to them because I don't want to be told what to do. Teens are very prone to shame because of this self-identity and this self-consciousness. And if they feel in any way belittled or, that they are getting something wrong or their ego feels hurt at all, I think they very quickly begin to hide. So I think that dynamic goes on very quickly. So not only are they doing these dangerous things, the parents are potentially being triggered. Well, I say dangerous things, but these new things that feel dangerous, parents are being triggered. And then the teen very quickly, I think, retreats and avoids.
I think it's really interesting to hear you talk about the different skill sets, actually, because I think there are a lot of people who are very good parents to younger children where things seems to go a bit awry in the teenage years, and obviously the parent's still a good, caring, loving parent, but somehow there's a misfire, isn't there? And then there ends up being this awful conflict, almost like loggerheads between the teenager and the parent, which is unfortunate. So this is really valuable information that you're sharing.
Just on that, there's a brilliant book that's just been published by David Yeager. It's called 10 to 25. It's about 500 pages long. But one of the big messages from all the research that's been done is that there's this big gap. He calls it the adolescent predicament, which is that adolescents, they have this huge drive for status and respect, which comes from their need for autonomy and their identity formation. Yet during the teenage years, there's a lot that they don't know. And there's a lot that they need to learn. So he talks about there being this gap. If you think about a graph, the need for status and respect goes like that, and what they know goes like that. And it actually takes a long time for those two lines to come together, probably way into a first job. And he says the way in which we resolve that predicament is through language. So the way in which we say things to teenagers, just the way we phrase things makes a huge difference. And they've done some studies to show that. So rather than saying, take this or do that, it's more things like, have you considered that? Or is this something you've thought about? So a lot of having space, listening, helping your kids to problem solve by themselves. Not only are you teaching them the skills of problem solving, but you are resolving that conflict of that adolescent predicament.
My child was 14 last weekend, so I think I'm going to get this
Okay,
book.
get that book.
Yeah, this is all brilliant advice. And how can we maintain closeness with our teenagers? We might have had those really intimate relationships with our kids when they were younger. How do we make sure that there's a version of that? I mean, you're talking about that, I guess, when you're talking about giving them space. Is there anything else that parents should do?
Well, I would say the first thing is just to bear in mind their drives and their focuses may be elsewhere, but it doesn't mean that they love you less. So try to make sure that you don't feel easily rejected or kind of upset by them wanting to be with other people. That's an important thing. When things erupt, and they might, I think we sometimes have an idea, well, there's a very old idea, which I think is out of date now, of a kind of timeout, go away and come back when you're better, come back when you're nicer, whatever it is. I would say try and stay calm. Actually, stay calm and stay with them. Stay close if you possibly can. Obviously not if people are being horrible or hurting each other. But if you can stay calm, your calm presence will really help them to be calm. And I think that really helps with this closeness, because they're going to have difficulties. I think sometimes we freak out if our child is struggling or they're sad or whatever. That's part of life. It's certainly part of the teenage years. They're going to have relationship difficulties. They're working out what friendships are. They're going to fall in love. I mean, that is a form of madness. They're probably going to have their heart broken. These are parts of development. And I think if you teach them early on that when they're struggling, you can be with them and help them calm down, it really, really helps. Maybe it's watching something together. Maybe it's going for a walk. It probably isn't going for a walk. Maybe it's playing their PlayStation game or whatever it is. Say little. This idea of attunement, I think, is such a great idea. So attunement basically means that rather than rushing in with your agenda about what you want to do, it's really taking a moment to say, I wonder where they are. I wonder what they need from me right now. It's so powerful as a human being. I mean, in all our relationships, but particularly with our kids. Paraphrasing is really helpful. If you kind of say back, so what, I think what you're saying to me is, you found today really hard. Not trying to fix it, but just paraphrasing. And that really validates, what's going on for them. And I think one of the great things I really always say to parents of teenagers is remember that listening is not the same as agreeing. And I think we want to, if our teenagers says something to us, like they come home and they say, that's it, so-and-so's awful, I'm not inviting you to my party or something like that, or I'm never going on holiday with you again, when they're cross or whatever it is. Yeah, just, remember that you say, wow, I can see she really upset you, or, you feel really cross with me right now. You're not agreeing with their statement, but you're just validating where they are. All those things will encourage your teenager to stay closer. And you have this incredible privilege of being able to help them to work things out. They've done some of these studies, these MRI studies, and they measure the relationship, the closeness of the parent and the teen. And then they have a look at what happens when the teen's in the situation and what bits of their brain light up. And the closer the relationship, the more the kind of parent bit of the brain that remembers them lights up. So working on this closeness and warmth in your relationship, and some of it might be, working on your own stuff, is really, really, really important, really powerful.
Thank you. Bettina, what happens if things have already gone wrong and the connections feel quite broken? Is it possible to repair them? What advice would you offer to parents who might be in that situation?
Yeah, so hard, so hard. I mean, one of the things is it takes time, and you might be listening to some of these skills and things that we're talking about and think, oh yeah, I've probably got that wrong. I've probably messed that up. And I think kids take a while to know that you've changed when you come in with something new. So sometimes parents will go, okay, I'm going to try this new thing. I'm going to try listening, or and then, they'll try it for a week or two and they'll go, well, it doesn't work with my kid. It's absolutely useless. So that's one thing, is to just remember it's going to take time. So be patient, keep trying little, and often. If you have a child who really won't open up to you, have the tiniest expectation first of all, and then see if you can build on that. I think it takes a lot of courage, actually. Repair in a relationship after a rupture. So a rupture is where the connection's been broken and your child kind of feels abandoned. Ruptures can happen in all relationships, actually. But it takes a lot of courage to come back and repair after a rupture. But a lot of the research, the psychological research, particularly in attachment theory, shows that that is the key thing for psychological safety. It's not how many ruptures you had. It's about whether there was repair after a rupture. And I would say the way in which we do a repair is really important. One of these things, this is one of the things I will teach to parents, give them almost a bit of a template. Because when there's been a rupture, let's say, for example, just to give you an example, you have a rule about the phone and there's no phones at night. And you go into your child's room one night and you see they've got a phone and they're hiding it under the cover. And you lose it and you go, oh my God, I can't believe you did that. We had a rule. And then they scream at you and say, oh my God, you're so controlling or something. There's probably a typical thing going on. So then later you think, gosh, I said some awful things. Or you might have said, that's it, I'm banning your phone for a year, or whatever you say in that moment of anger. That's a rupture, and I think it needs a repair. Now, what parents will do is they'll come back in and they'll start with the behavior. Now, we need to talk about when you went on your phone the other night. If you do that, you've lost them. You're back in everyone's emotional. There's no thinking taking place. So what I would say, first of all, is to offer something up yourself. And it does take courage to say, do you know what? I think I said some really horrid things the other night. I think I was feeling really cross when I saw you with your phone, and that probably didn't feel great for you. Now, it's really hugely generous. I understand. You weren't the one who started it. But I think as a parent, to be able to go in and do that it's the best way in which we repair things. And then you say, can you tell me a little bit? Be really curious. Can you tell me a bit about what happened? Because I know most nights you're really good at keeping your phone out. But was there something that night that meant that, you really wanted your phone or whatever it is? You're being very curious. You're being very compassionate. And then hopefully in time, as you do that more and more, your child will begin to say, well, the thing was that there was a party the next day and everyone was talking, and you can be compassionate about that. It doesn't mean you change the boundaries, so you've got to be courageous. But I think coming at it that way is the best way. And you're also modeling for them to be able to come back and say, do you know what? I think I really messed up. I'm really sorry I was rude to you yesterday. It's a great thing to model for them to do as well.
I think, Bettina, you seem to be talking a lot about respect really as well, and I think sometimes you hear parents talking to children in a way that you think they would never talk to other visitors to their homes in that way. There's a real lack of respect for them as a human being. I'm not talking about trying to treat your children like they're your friends, but there is something about making sure that we give our children just the basics of respect in how we communicate, isn't there?
Definitely, and particularly teenagers, because they are so prone to feeling infantilized, to feeling disrespected. So we do have to be, and we do have to respect them. I think there's a bit of an old style traditional view that I'm going to lose my power or my authority if I do that. But I think that's very outdated now. Yeah, I completely agree with you.
If your child is an angel at school but feels quite challenging at home, do you have any advice to offer there?
Yeah, really hard. It must feel really annoying for those parents. I mean, one thing I think this question alerts me to a bit is just thinking about some form of neurodiversity. So there are some young people, particularly we have got much better at identifying girls who are on the autism spectrum, who actually are very good at following rules. They actually kind of fear getting things wrong. And at school, they can be working extremely hard to keep it together and to follow the social rules and to learn what's expected of them. So they do a lot of what we call camouflaging or masking. So they're watching closely what other people do and they're making sure they change themselves to fit in. Kids who are doing that, when they come home, their resources are empty. Our frontal lobes, which is this bit of the brain that regulates behavior and emotions, is a very limited resource for all of us. And I think there are many young people who are working so hard to keep it together at school that when they get home, that's gone. So I think that could be what's going on. And I think thinking about how to manage that, well, I mean, if you suspect that there may be some neurodiversity, obviously you want to do an assessment and really have a look at that. But maybe, being very aware of that and reducing your expectations in terms of what you might expect at the end of a school day. Curiosity is really your biggest tool, I think, here. And I think, again, it's being brave and saying, I wonder what it is. Is there something about what's happening in the family that is making things hard for my child? Behavior is a form of communication. However hard it is, we want to kind of blame kids and say they're bad or they're whatever. But if we've got into a narrative about our child is bad or our child is doing this to me, that's a bit of an alert to say there's something going on. I don't know, I kind of like this phrase, if it's hysterical, it's probably historical. Or if you're curious, get furious. Sorry, other way around. If you're furious, get curious. Yeah, so I think if there is something going on like that, I think we really have to look underneath the behaviour and think what's going on for our child.
Thanks very much, Bettina. So
Mm.
you have mentioned neurodiversity already, but why are we seeing so much of it these days?
Well, I think there's definitely, we're recognizing more individual differences. I think we're more tolerant of individual differences. I think social media and the amount of content on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube and all the other places, there's a lot of people posting about it and people can see bits of themselves in it. So I think a lot of it, I don't think there's an increase in ADHD and autism. I think we're just recognizing it more. And I think we're probably recognizing more milder cases of it. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bit of a possibility of overdiagnosing potentially. And I'm very curious about that and wondering why people are searching for a diagnosis, why they're reaching for it. And I wonder if that's actually to do with compassion, to do with us all feeling a bit overwhelmed actually with what's going on in the world, with apart from the internet, but the climate and the academic pressure kids are under to perform extremely well, apart from other things that we might talk about. But I think for young people and even adults, they're looking at it and going, oh, that's me. I think I have ADHD, and that explains why I keep, being late for things, or I'm not doing very well, or I can't focus, or whatever it is. So I think there's a possibility we're overdiagnosing, but I think recognizing the skills that you're struggling with and being compassionate with yourself about that is a really good thing. And I would always, always encourage that. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. You've raised the question of diagnosis, of course, which reminds me of years and years and years ago when I worked in psychiatry in Oxford. Consultant called Bertie Mandelbrot, and he was obviously, I thought he was very wise. He would say that sometimes it was comforting and helpful for someone to have a diagnosis because it gave them some sort of understanding of why things were the way they were.
Yeah.
And that sounds a bit similar to what you're just describing.
Yeah, I really see that. I really understand why that's the case. With ADHD, I think there's a bit of a probably false belief that medication will solve everything. When it doesn't, I think it really helps some young people with focus and attention. But I love the framework of the executive function skills, of thinking about all the skills that you need in life and which ones am I struggling with. That doesn't make me a bad person. We're all different, but how can I strengthen them? So I think that we can be just as compassionate without getting a diagnosis, although I really see that there is a place for a diagnosis as well.
Thank you. And you've also mentioned identity and the struggle for identity, which some of us continue throughout our lives,
Yeah.
of course. So how as parents can we help our kids discover a healthy identity?
Well, awareness, first of all, that there is this identity formation that's going on during the teenage years. Teens are very sensitive to things that are said about them by others, personal things that are said. It's a bit like having a very thin skin, the armor that I think younger children have. Things will just bounce off them. During the teenage years, that doesn't necessarily happen. So I think being very cautious and intentional with what you say and what feedback you give to kids. Building them up and not knocking them down is a key thing. And I think we have had a shift culturally and generationally in that respect. We used to think if you said to some, put a kid down and said you were stupid or whatever, that would switch them into doing something different. And I think we now know that that's not helpful. I think increasing self-awareness for young people is just such a kind of underrated and underspoken about thing that we can do for young people. And we do that by asking questions, by increasing this, what I would call metacognition. Metacognition is kind of standing above yourself and reflecting on yourself. So asking questions, making comments, wondering about things, helping kids to develop a healthy concept of themselves as a person, I think is really good. So as an example, if you have a young person, let's say you have a young person who has many, many positive things going on, but you notice that they really struggle with flexibility. Some people are a bit inflexible. So when things change, they really struggle, or they have an idea and they get a bit fixed on their idea. It can be quite frustrating as a parent, to do as often kids with autism will struggle with flexibility. One of the things I think you can do with all of these difficulties is to reframe them in a very positive way to build up a kid's self-identity. So you would begin by talking about this thing called flexibility. Sometimes we have this skill in our brain, and when things change, we just have to switch. Some people find it easy to switch. Other people don't find it easy to switch. So name it going on in the world before you even get to naming it in your child. And then when you see them being flexible, I would say, give them that positive feedback. Wow, you were so flexible then. We were going for a walk and it started raining, and that you were really able to be flexible. Maybe they didn't want to go for the walk. But anyway, finding positive situations in which you can give them that feedback. And then in time, working on helping them to see that they can adapt that and they can change that. So I think that's one of the ways in which we take some of the difficult parts of their kind of struggles or personality or whatever skills, and we can help to make it a positive part of this identity. I have a bit of a personal story of that because I had a son who struggled a bit with that. He didn't want to get in the bath and he didn't want to get out of the bath when he was there. He wouldn't want to go on holiday. When we were on holiday, he wouldn't want to come home. There was this very happy where he was, but kind of changing was hard for him. And I managed to build up this idea over time, like, that's really hard for you. Or, I think this is going to be a struggle because I'm going to, the things are going to change. And so I was able to be compassionate. And then I remember we were going to Japan actually when he was about 15, and he said, I'm going to really try and be flexible and try all new things that are happening, which was quite brave. It's quite a place to try all the new things in Japan with all of the cultural differences. So I think that really helps. I think loving what they love is a really important thing that we miss out sometimes, particularly in the time of screens and phones, and parents will say, why are you on that damn game again? Now, if a young person loves that game and the person they love most in their life, their parent, hates that game, that's quite confusing for them. So I think we have to really be prepared to join them where they are in their world and try to understand. Because if you try to understand them, they will try to understand themselves. And we want them to understand themselves because this self-awareness is so, so crucially important to build a positive identity where you don't get kids who avoid or shut down or have shame, those kinds of things. I heard this lovely quote actually from somebody, and it was actually Glennon Doyle. I don't know if anyone's heard of her, but she said, I think a child who was neurodiverse, and she said, I realized I spent so much of my time trying to make my child fit into the world. And then I realized that I am the world to my child. It was really powerful. And just that idea that if you love them for all they are and everything that they are, even the difficult bits, then they are going to form this healthy identity and be able to go out into the world and be proud of everything that they are.
That is a really beautiful quote. I didn't catch the name of the person who said that.
Yeah, Glennon Doyle. She's an American. She's got a podcast called We Can Do Hard Things. She's quite a character.
Thank you.
But yeah.
But just thinking about identity, Bettina, and obviously we've talked about the sort of the apparent increase in neurodiversity that, as you say, may not be a real increase, has me thinking about some of the other challenges that teenagers have faced around their physical identity. And do we talk to kids enough about their bodies and how their physical identities manifest?
I don't think we do we? Particularly not teenagers, yeah. I have a little podcast called Just One Thing for Parents, and I did an episode with Anastasas Biliados on this, which really opened my eyes to it as well. And he was saying that, we are comfortable discussing bodies of younger children, but when the teenage years come, there's often this awkwardness. And actually, a lot of teenagers can have what he calls embodied distress, which gets expressed as an eating disorder or in other kind of ways. Because a teenage body is changing really significantly. And I think we're really missing an opportunity to help them to, to kind of make peace with those differences and make peace with their bodies. I think for a lot of us, certainly for me, we grew up in an era where there was quite a lot of body shaming, particularly for women, actually. And I think we can often carry that into our parenting. So we have to be aware of that and be a little bit brave. Be prepared to talk about maybe your own experience, but maybe be observant, be cautious when talking about teenagers' body because of what's going on with this identity development. Don't avoid it. Like, talk about with acceptance and care, obviously, but try to talk about, how does it feel, and what's going on for you. I think we are at a time when young people are talking to each other. That's my experience, much more about bodies. But as parents, I think we need to be brave and do that too.
Thank you, Bettina. And finally, how do you look after your own emotional well-being whilst doing the work that you're doing?
Well, one of the amazing things that we have when we're mental health professionals or clinical psychologists is something called supervision. And supervision is where we go and we meet with somebody else and we talk about the work that we're doing. And we think about the areas that are difficult for us. We think about these kind of triggers, or this person, reminded me of someone in my past, or I felt really cross with that parent. So I think that's really important for me. I do a bit of yoga. In fact, I'm training as a yoga teacher at the moment. I'm not sure that I'll really teach yoga, but the process of learning about yoga, the whole, the yoga philosophy and all of that, the Buddhist philosophy, it's really helpful for me. I'm really enjoying it. I walk and talk with colleagues. I have a couple of colleagues. We meet every week. We walk on the heath. I live in London. I have my own therapy. I have a coach. So I think it's really important, and I think I do lots and lots of things. I think you have to be brave enough as an adult to be curious about yourself, to always know that you can learn and you can grow and that you really don't know everything. I also surround myself by young people. I have two wonderful kids in their 20s, and I surround myself as much as I can with them and their friends, and that's wonderful.
Thank you, Bettina. Really, for me, a very useful conversation. I really enjoyed that. Thanks very much.
Yes, indeed. A bit late for me, but nevertheless, you do explain things so very clearly. Thanks very much indeed.
Well, thank you so much for having me.